It's only been about 5 minutes, but you can already start to see the yeast growing, forming colonies. So I'm not sure how well you can see it, but you should be able to see that the middle of the liquid in the bowl looks different at the edges, and those are yeast colonies. So they're expanding, there's all kinds of bubbles forming, and that's good. Our yeast is definitely alive, and it would have taken quite a bit longer for that to happen if we hadn't put the sugar in. So, yay, sugar, speeding things up. And because I'm going to give it a fairly long rise, that's really all I need to see that the yeast is alive. But if you want to wait and let it proof some more, go right ahead. Alright, so obviously we needed yeast and water, and now I'm going to put my yeast back in the fridge because you have to keep yeast, once you open it, in the fridge or the freezer because it lasts longer that way. So sometimes you might forget and accidentally leave a jar out for a couple days, and it might be okay or it might not, but I try to avoid doing that now. So the other three ingredients that we need besides water and yeast are salt, white flour, and I just use all-purpose flour, but if you feel fancy, you can get bread flour, and whole wheat flour. But if you don't feel like having more than one kind of flour, you can definitely make this bread with just all-purpose flour, and it'll turn out fine. So the recipe calls for 3/4 cup wheat flour and 4 cups of white flour. But I'm not too particular about actually measuring, and I like to use a slightly higher proportion of wheat flour. Up to you, but in breads that use a mix of wheat flour and white flour, you can usually get away with up to about 50% wheat flour. After that, the texture starts to change, and you have to make some other changes so that it'll be tasty. But usually up to 50% wheat flour without making any changes to the recipe. So I'm going to start with about a cup of wheat flour, and I'm just sprinkling it on top of my yeast water mixture. So there's sort of a floating layer of flour on top of the liquid. I'm also going to add my salt now. The recipe calls for 1 tablespoon of salt. You definitely want to add salt to your bread, otherwise you will know that you left it out and it will taste incredibly bland and not very nice. So again, I'm going to sprinkle this over the surface so that it's not all in one place. I want it to be sort of distributed throughout. Now, if you wanted, you could, say, mix your flour and your salt in a separate bowl and then add it bit by bit. But I don't like to do that, first because it requires another bowl, and second because depending on how humid it is outside and all kinds of factors, you might need slightly more or slightly less flour. So if you mix up your flour and your salt ahead of time, you might end up with more than you need, and that just seems unnecessary to me. So I got the spoon, the one that I was using to mix the yeast into the water before. Now I'm going to mix in that first cup of flour and the salt. And I'm not going to mix it until it's smooth or anything. I'm just sort of giving it a little bit of a mix. Now I'm going to add about half a cup more wheat flour. But again, I take a somewhat casual approach to measuring. You can certainly actually measure these things if you want. And again, I'm sprinkling it on top. I'm going to go ahead and add some all-purpose flour to about half a cup. Sprinkle that on top. And now I'm going to stir it in. So that's 2 cups of flour. The recipe calls for 4 3/4 cups of flour in total. We'll see how much we end up actually using. Alright, so take a look at what this looks like so far. It's like a really thick batter, but it's definitely not a dough yet. It's still really liquidy and messy. So I'm going to add more flour. and also just the computer screen. All right, so here's a heaping cup of all-purpose flour, which brings us up to 3 cups of flour in total. And now it's starting to get a little drier. Stirring is becoming more of an issue. And also, I just knocked some flour out of the bowl and onto the floor. Oh, and onto me too. So that's actually a useful tip. I don't know about you, but I'm incapable of making flour without making bread without getting flour on me. So, you know, maybe plan to do a load of laundry after you bake bread. That would be my recommendation. Okay, so this is getting much stiffer, and it's actually, at this point, it's more of a wet dough than a stiff batter. It's trying to form a ball, but it's not quite there yet. Now you could definitely add another cup of flour to the bowl and stir. That's an option. But I actually prefer kneading to stirring. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dump a bunch of flour in my measuring cup. And I'm going to sprinkle it on the counter. Fairly thickly, but then I'm going to spread it out a little more. Maybe a little too bright for you to see this. That's really the best I can do. Hopefully you can see that there's some flour on here. Now, I'm going to dump out the dough. I'll try and let you see it a bit. So I'm just knocking it out with the spoon and then getting it off the spoon. It's really quite sticky at this point, so it's going to get all over your hands, but you're going to need it anyway, so that's about to happen regardless. Then I have this dough scraper, which is just a little piece of plastic, which is really convenient for scraping out bowls and then later for scraping off your counter and get all the little sniblets of dough that are stuck to the sides out. Okay, so this is a clean counter with a layer of flour and then the messy, shaggy dough. And now I'm going to put some more flour on top so that it doesn't all stick to my hands when I start to knead it. Okay, so now I'm going to start kneading, and hopefully you can see that basically I'm just sort of folding the dough. So I pull it toward me, I sort of pick up the part that's closest, and I push it forward. And you want to turn the dough so that it gets evenly kneaded. Basically what you want to do is you're working flour into the dough, and you want it to be worked in evenly. You don't want there to be, some really wet patches with a really hard crust. So by turning the dough, you make it easier for everything to be evenly distributed. At this point, it's still really wet, and there's just sort of a layer of flour on the outside that we're gradually working in. Now it's starting to stick to my fingers, so I need to redistribute some of the flour. Now you don't want to use too much flour. If you work too much flour into the dough, it'll be dry and stiff, and it won't taste as good or rise as well. So you want to err on the side of too wet of a dough. But we've only added 3 cups of flour out of the almost 5 that the recipe calls for, so we've got a ways to go. So again, basically, the dough is starting to hold together a little more. It's less shaggy. So I pull it toward me, I pick up the part that's closest to me, and then mostly with the heels of my hands, I push it forward again, then I bring it back, and I turn it 90 degrees, and then I do the whole thing over again. you're actually supposed to knead this particular dough for about 10 minutes, which is a long time, especially if you haven't done this before. So you'll start to think, well, is anything changing? And why am I doing this? And your arms might start to hurt a little bit because, you know, it's pretty repetitive and you do have to push down a bit. But it definitely does change. It's worth maybe not 10 minutes. You could probably cut off a couple minutes if you really wanted to, but it does keep changing in consistency. So the last time I showed you it was holding together, but now it's almost a ball. It's getting much firmer and less liquidy. And you'll find that as you knead it, you might think, oh, this is great, but then as you keep kneading it, the flour toward the outside of the dough will get worked in, and it'll start to feel really sticky again. And that's good. That's exactly what you want. That means that the middle must have still been really wet, and now the flour is getting more evenly distributed. Alright, so at this point, the dough is it's holding together a lot better. So what I'm doing is less folding than pushing. So I draw it back toward me, I push, again, mostly with the heels of my hands. And if you're pushing fairly firmly forward, you don't need quite as much flour and the dough doesn't stick to your hands quite as much as it might otherwise. So just something to keep in mind. And at this point, I'm not adding any more flour right now. All the flour on this particular path of the counter has been worked in. I'm just working the dough until I decide it needs more flour. Which will be soon, because when I stop pushing now, the dough is trying to come back with my hand instead of just sit on the counter, so I'm going to spread a little more of the flour in. And personally, as the dough starts to come together, I tend to switch to this style of kneading where I push it with one hand and then push it at a 45-degree angle with the other. But you can certainly go ahead with kneading straight forward and then turning 90 degrees with both hands. Either way, it will work just fine. Now, if at some point, probably earlier than the point where we've gotten to now, your hands are just covered with really sticky dough and you can't stand it anymore, take a break, wash your hands. Once you get that dough off your hands, the rest of it won't be quite as likely to stick to you. So just dry your hands really carefully afterward, and that makes a big difference. So generally when you're reading a recipe, it'll tell you to knead the dough until it's smooth and elastic. And you'll be kneading the dough and you'll think, so what the hell does that mean? Which is a perfectly reasonable thing to think. And it's starting to get there. So it feels more evenly moist, and it holds its shape a bit. But it also, for example, you can still see the prints of my hands when I just stop working it. So that's good. We're getting there. We're certainly not 10 minutes in it. And again, it's sticking to my hands. Not a lot. I could certainly keep going, but I could also add more flour at this point. And if you ever feel like you've added a ton of flour, it's still really sticky, one thing you can do is just set the dough down, cover it up, I usually use the bowl that I was using earlier and just let it sit for maybe 15 minutes, and you'll find it's a lot easier to work with afterward and you can finish your meat then. So actually that's what I'm going to do right now.